B Corp is a fantastic organisation. We haven't fallen out. I think they're great. But they have decided to get narrower and much more demanding in terms of who your customers are and your supply chain and the like. And that's kind of where the new standard is going now. Inevitably, as a consulting firm, we've always lent into working with challenging organisations. Every organisation we onboard, we get the team to look at and work out corporately whether we're delighted, happy, yes or no. And B Corp were going to make that much harder to do because they had some much more black and white rules.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders are doing and what they've learned along the way. My guest today is Richard Corderoy, Chief Executive Officer of the Oakland Group, a consultancy that helps organizations achieve more with their data. When Richard joined me on the podcast back in 2022, we talked about Oakland's purpose, inspiring clients to transform the world by using their data more effectively. A lot has happened since then. Oakland achieved B Corp certification in 2023, underscoring its commitment to values that go beyond the bottom line. That same year, they were appointed to the UK government's G Cloud 13 procurement framework, expanding their reach into the public sector. More recently, in 2025, they were recognized as the best consultancy in the UK by the Best Company Awards. And in a major development, Softcat plc acquired Oakland Group, marking a new chapter in the firm's journey. I'm excited to reconnect and to hear from Richard about how his team has navigated these big changes. Richard, welcome back to the Purposeful Strategist.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. Really great. I know this is audio only and our listeners can't see, but there's just something about your infectious enthusiasm that comes across when you can see it, and I'm sure will come through in our conversation. Anyway, when we last spoke in 2022, one of the things you talked about was sort of balancing your vision of what the business could become with the perspectives of some long-standing team members. Looking back now, do you feel you've found that balance?
Yeah, I think we have. We've been through a period, when we were last speaking actually, a period of really rapid growth. There was the post-COVID boom from a consulting point of view, and we brought a really quite substantial number of new people into the firm. And so we very much took the decision in actually 2023 to really double back down and kind of have a good look at ourselves again, partly because actually these things do evolve, and also partly because it was a mechanism of rebinding this now bigger group. Some of the leadership team have changed as well. So rebinding the bigger group around, I think, the same core purpose, and then how we talk about it and what we do with it. So the journey's very much continued over the last few years.
And congratulations on this best consultancy in the UK win. What do you think your team's doing differently that sort of earned that recognition?
I think it's two things. One of which is kind of the very much the sort of the measurable part of that. So we do genuinely look after the team. You know, we have good packages, good health. You know, we moved into a new office environment, which is just fantastic. And I think if you were to look at the building blocks from the outside for a firm of our size and scale and life cycle, that's quite a good package, but perhaps not exceptional. I think the other part is people genuinely buy into the firm. And it's always been true, and it predates me. Oakland really does become part of the people who join it. I think we have relatively few people who are just workers and, you know, wage slaves and come and do their thing and go. The number of people who really very quickly after joining are all in and really believe in what we do, I think kind of brings that depth. I think the other part I would probably highlight is it's very easy to plan these things when everything is going well, and I think it's how the team see you react when things go badly. Over the last year, inevitably, we've had some bumps. We've had some commercial bumps and lost a customer, you know, those sorts of things. We've had some, unfortunately, some sad things that have happened within the team in terms of their personal lives breaking through. And actually, how we react, how sincerely we react, the fact that people see that the leadership team genuinely do care, I think people recognize that, and that does become part of the business.
You know, Richard, one of the things you've touched on there, I think, is something that maybe doesn't get talked about as much as perhaps it could, which is, you know, how important it is the way in which businesses, because Oakland is a business, how businesses react to the personal.
Yes. It's funny because over the years we've grown up and we've got HR policies and this and that and everything else, but we've never lost the ability to do the right thing and own the right thing. And of course, it's a minefield because you set a precedent and the right thing for one person, all of that stuff. But I think it is worth navigating that. I think if you reduce it just back to the rules say you get 22 days or whatever it is, if it's just reduced to that, then you do lose something. And I think actually as a leader, you stop leading and you just defer to a rule, which isn't leadership. So yes, here's the basics. And we do then, quite happily have the conversation with the business. Person X, we're going to do this for because, within the bounds of confidentiality, because of this, this and this. We've got someone at the moment who's on, a particular course of treatment. And of course, we're going to change the sick policy for them because we want to help them get better, not give them financial distress for the last month or whatever it is. So it's just being very human about it, but also holding that intention of, you have to have a business, we have to make money, we have to be profitable, but also being able to talk to people about that. And previously, we've always tried to keep the business adult to our customers and to our team and everyone. And so generally people respond quite well to that conversation.
Yeah. This acquisition by Softcat, clearly a big milestone. Interested to hear why that was the right move for Oakland. I can see why it was the right move for them, but you might even want to sketch that out a bit. But why was it the right move for Oakland? And what does it mean for your team, your clients, your strategy from here?
For a 40-year-old business, probably now third generation of leadership within it, to go down the route of a sale is a fairly big deal. And when we embarked on this, we were fairly clear up front with what we wanted to achieve. And actually we got some help to help us really crisp on that criteria downstream. And there's a little bit about managing retirements and succession. There's a bit about helping with investment into the future, also unlocking, we've been very good as a business of always kind of unlocking future value for the next generation of leaders. And so we haven't got all the value bottled up in a couple of people at the top. And so we wanted to kind of do all of that, and we looked at private equity and other routes. And ultimately, even though the seduction of perhaps the big money routes was strong, when you come back to those criteria, the acquisition by Softcat actually made perfect sense. Strategically, we've always grown organically. There's an Oakland-shaped hole in their business. A big business that didn't have our capability, they now have our capability. And the broad plan is a sort of benign brother, sister, parent, whatever word you want to use, that is going to help us grow into that space in their business. But, allowing us to kind of still be ourselves as we do that. And so that's very compelling for the future of Oakland. There's a part of that which allows the team to really enjoy that growth, both from a career point of view, but also financially. And at the back end, it sorts out a load of other bits in terms of shareholders and succession and that side of life. So it was kind of a really perfect fit. But I think the bit that really mattered is actually they were a client of ours, and culturally, for a FTSE firm, very, very similar. And I think, like they are a sales organization, they're very young. We do have our differences. But actually, if I look at their leadership and actually how that leadership flows into their entire business in terms of their values in terms of expertise, even down to sort of fun and the way they run their offices, their integrity, they use different words. Previously, we talked about love being one of our values, and you can see that in what they do and how they react. And, for me, when you sell a business, at some level, you have to let it go a bit. That's part of the tradition. But I can see a place where kind of grafting a branch onto a tree where Oakland can genuinely join in and grow and be sometimes joined up more, sometimes still separate.
Maybe just for anybody who isn't quite up to speed with the sector and the industry, just a quick thumbnail sketch of Softcat and how Oakland sort of fits in. I like that idea of an Oakland size, shaped hole, but just take us through how they fit together a little bit more.
Yeah, so Softcat, this is perhaps doing them a disservice because I'm narrowing them down, but broadly they are value-added resellers. So you would phone them up and you can buy everything from whiteboards to computers to data centers, and their offering is vast in that sense in terms of the number of products. typically people would talk about Microsoft or a vendor licensing arrangement with them and those sorts of things these days. And they act as an intermediary to help a business face into a sea of vendors and suppliers and sellers, which is just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds strong. So they give advice on that. And their kind of core USP is that they are all about long-term account managers, essentially. Their internal strategy is their people are really important because that's what builds the relationship with their customers, and that's what correlates with the future. So that's great. They can do hardware, software, data centers, whatever. But actually one of the bits in that as kind of an emerging market need is the bit around data and particular data expertise. And that is both because it's a thing that you'd want to be able to offer your customers as a service in its own right, but also very often data is the kind of the golden thread that goes from the hardware through everything else. And so there is definitely an opportunity there, and they're not an acquisitive business. So this is their first acquisition ever. And so kind of the abundance of caution that goes with that has been a kind of a big feature of what we've done.
Kind of connected to that, one of the concerns that sellers often have is our culture, part of what made this the place it is, and sort of the promise we've made to employees when they join, could be diluted, even destroyed. How's that working out? You talked about love. How are you preserving that sense of identity and values around loving your work, loving your colleagues, loving your clients? How's all that actually happening on the ground?
It's a really good question. I think, if we rewind in the history, inevitably the first part of the process is all worrying about the deal and the mechanics. But very quickly, we both collectively got on to this will fail if we upset the teams on either party, actually, because inevitably there are people in Softcat who kind of go, well, I do a bit of what they do and vice versa and all the rest of it. And so, how we've taken the team through that has been managed to within an inch of its life. We've been on a very intentional 6-month program. There is a benefit here, and the core benefit is we're going to grow faster than we were going to otherwise. Softcat aren't just owning us and now thrashing us to a target. They're owning us, and the quid pro quo really is that they're introducing us to their thousands of customers. So, that is fantastic for Oakland. It's fantastic for people's careers. And the promise was, that's great, but under the bonnet, we're going to largely stay the same organization, actually, in terms of our values, in terms of what we care about, in terms of our independence, in terms of the way we work. And people believed us, and this is back to the integrity of leadership. And now, really, the past 6 months, as we've started to get closer together, has been just an ongoing demonstration of this is the truth. What we promised is what we're delivering. And equally, being very clear that occasionally, of course, things will happen that jar. Inevitably, someone says something or something happens, or our processes don't quite plug together. And actually, it's just been really open with the team that, this is a problem, isn't it? We haven't thought this bit through. So let's go solve the problem. They're acting in good faith. We're acting in good faith. And off we go. And so far, the response from the team has been brilliant.
If you can talk about it, what are the longer term plans around both kind of brand name and organizational sort of, I won't say separation, but, kind of demarcation?
I think this is one of the areas where we're kind of getting it right now, because the honest answer is we don't know. There is a broad intent for the business to come together. There are no synergies or anything like that, so it's coming together in the right way to build a bigger and better future. I think this is back to the abundance of caution of, well, what was the point 2 months before the deal or 3 months before the deal where we sort of knew one another, but inevitably, with the Chinese wall between you, what's the point of making really hard decisions about the future on day one? We're going to take it soft, so let's get alongside, let's get growing, let's actually focus on the core essence of the business case, which is they supply leads, we grow, we help with expertise back. So let's get that bit going. And then over time, we will work out whether or not actually a combined brand, a single brand, or all of those kind of questions will get answered. And it proves that by the time we get to thornier questions, that trust is there and we get there's how it fits and all the rest of it. And so I do think that's the right way around. Part of the arrangement is a very long-term commitment from the current leadership team. And so, the core of the Oakland leadership isn't going anywhere. And so that gives us the space to work these things out for the collective good. And I would be nervous now if I was committed to a plan that I had made, a year ago before we got to know one another.
One other thing interested to hear about is the sort of B Corp situation. Has that been affected at all? Is Softcat B Corp, is their ownership changing any of that? That feels like that could be potentially really amazing and productive ground to cover, and could also be a bit thorny.
So you have zeroed in on one of the most thorny bits of this, and one of those examples where we've had to be really open with the team on what we're doing. And the reality is we won't be able to continue with B Corp. But actually, if you unpick that, that is not a Softcat-led issue. It just happens to be that these two decisions have coincided at the same moment in time. And how you get the team to understand that and believe that, that's part of what we've had to do. And, the real reason is B Corp is a fantastic organization. We haven't fallen out. I think they're great. But they have decided to get narrower and much more demanding in terms of who your customers are and your supply chain and the like. And that's kind of where the new standard is going now. Inevitably, as a consulting firm, we've always lent into working with challenging organizations. Every organization we onboard, we get the team to look at and work out corporately whether we're delighted, happy, yes, or no. And B Corp were going to make that much harder to do because they had some much more black and white rules. And so it was interesting because we had a choice of, actually, we could have continued on. Softcat, and their chief exec was very clear. If you want to keep going, you can keep going. There was no corporate pressure from them to us to do anything. But again, it was that choice around integrity to go, well, hang on, rather than an increasingly disingenuous argument where perhaps the reality of what we're doing and what the standard says are starting to drift apart. Let's grasp the nettle, actually use that as a catalyst. And again, the message to the team is, look, the standard that was B Corp is baked into our processes. It's what we do. We don't actually have to do anything special to keep that going. And let's reimagine what our engagement with social issues and the environment and those things look like in the context of us joining a bigger organization where, sometimes we want to say small and local and Oakland, and that's great. Sometimes actually, particularly on some of the environmental stuff, doing that with a bigger partner that also takes it very seriously gives us kind of more clout. And I think it's kind of the right thing to do from a personal point of view and feels like a good transition in terms of starting to point to the future.
The point you made about it, sort of the current B Corp standards and approach being baked into the way you do things really resonates with me. I can sort of see how that would happen. I am a little curious as to whether you've thought about looking around for some other external, both challenge and validation of what you're doing? Or is it like, it was a useful framework to get us to where we are. They've sort of moved in a direction that isn't where we want to go. And we're happy, but we don't feel we need somebody to give us a stamp.
That's probably where we're at in the short term. I think there are other things where, again, Softcat friends now have things like ISO 14000, so the environmental standards and things that we've never traditionally engaged with. So actually, in the short term, kind of in terms of baking what we do in, Softcat actually feels like kind of the richest place to be and not embarking on another effectively standard or integration program. And I do feel comfortable. Part of B Corp is you write an impact report. We're still going to write an impact report. We're still going to keep those things going that hold us to account. And ultimately, we plug into the governance and seniority committee of Softcat now. So again, they'll hold us to account in terms of making sure that we don't let the thing drop. Probably a couple of times we've drifted here in terms of this kind of inner DNA, which if it's strong and has integrity and people buy into, then it actually gives you quite a lot of freedom. We don't want that. That's probably the most important part of what we need to achieve over the next few years, and we're going to have another period of quite substantive growth, is keeping that kind of inner DNA, that inner core strong and straight, and then the rest of it will fit in around it almost.
I mean, this whole conversation, frankly, and probably the last time we spoke too, is the extent to which you're in a very sort of intentional, alive kind of way, navigating some tricky, ethical, moral, who are we, what kind of people are we issues, without reaching, as I think some people do, sort of to something external that says, well, this is the way you have to do it. that you're taking that as input, but really it sounds like sort of finding the Oakland way through some of these. In some ways, it could even sound slightly ambiguous, but I think ambiguity is part of life.
Yes, it strikes me that our society generally is ever more polarized, and however one gets their moral compass, I have faith, others don't, some believe in this, some believe in that, to assert that any one view is the absolute right way, I'm not sure it's helpful for society, and kind of almost is the easy way out. And so I am delighted when we run at problems with people with different point of views. I think, you come back to something like love as a value. When you unpack that for customers, for the business, for one another, for yourself, not as of some silly emotion, but as actual actions, people are very, very consistent. And let's have the difficult conversations about who we work with, where we work, what we do, and not default to, in effect, someone else's line. Particularly in a consulting business where we are functionally experts to a very broad set of sectors, you have to face into this question almost every single day because, company A is okay, company B is okay, company B is okay, but they want to do this. You get into all the ethics of AI and all of that. And then you look at the standards relating to AI and they're struggling to keep up or not necessarily practitioners, and that does some of them a disservice. So you have to trust that your own team is going to do stuff ethically and properly. That's kind of why I keep coming back to the DNA. It's so important.
You put AI into the conversation, so I'm gonna chase the new shiny object for a second. What role do you see AI playing? Not so much, kind of in the economy more generally, but specifically in the kind of data consultancy work that you and Oakland do.
I've been consulting now for 20 plus years, and you go back to the day where if you had the pack of models, that was enough to give you the edge inside the customer because they didn't have the pack of models. And then obviously the internet came along and anyone can download the 4-box grid or the change model or whatever it is. And very quickly, if you're going to keep consulting, you realize it's about your experience and how you bring people together and how you stitch solutions across sort of a complicated landscape. I think data's on a similar path, actually. Even in, 2018, when we pivoted into data, there was a season where actually having the people who could physically just do the code and knew how to write stuff was all you needed to be successful because they were vanishingly rare. I think it is true that world is being disrupted actually from two ways. One is the tools, the kit that we use is just much more mature. You think about, how much of a mechanic you'd have to be to drive a car in the 1940s or 50s versus today you get in, turn the key, it just damn works. And you can see, the products are getting better. And obviously AI is helping particularly developers develop faster, and some of those core skills are changing. So it is changing us. But actually, you keep going back to, well, fundamentally, it's about people, it's about capability, it's about understanding the organizational context, it's about the politics and how you get things done in organizations that need to change, and then how do you bring a customer-led solution as opposed to a vendor-led, our box does everything, and all that stuff. I think that's as valuable as ever, if probably more valuable, because it's a very, very noisy world out there.
It's kind of related. I mean, consultancy, I think itself is changing, somewhat driven by AI, but driven by a whole lot of other things. So, looking from an Oakland perspective, where do you see the biggest opportunities, the biggest leverage in terms of helping clients achieve more with their data?
So I think data is an interesting topic in that it's matured as an industry all at once. And it hasn't had like a slow ramp up. And so at one end, people want to do AI and Gen AI and build robots and all that good stuff. And at the other end, organizations are still wrestling with data quality, with the basics of just, is it in good shape? I think many businesses have probably spent 20 years trying to get their kind of structured data looking good. The database is the transactions. You look at SharePoint and where all the written stuff goes, and there's work to be done, should we say. And so the opportunity is, actually, how do you mature both kind of the boring end and the kind of governance-y and the enabling end, and keep the promise of what the new tools might bring going at once? And certainly for us, that's where customers are going. And increasingly, it is an integrated everything is the answer. And so you have to be able to talk not just about data or not just about technology or not just about hardware or whatever. Customers are looking for people to bring that all together. And I suspect so a mixture of advancing data whilst being able to talk about everything else, I think is certainly going to be the evolution for the next 5 years. And beyond that, in the consulting world, I think it's very hard to call.
Well, one might argue 5 years is a long time.
From our point of view, we describe ourselves as a 40-year-old startup, and even from 2018, where we became a very clear data company and we lent in and we did a lot of very intentional stuff, where we now mid-25, the world is just entirely different. And so the half-life of what is today's norm, I think, is reducing very, very quickly.
Yeah. So if you did look 5 years ahead, what would lead you to say, yeah, we got this next chapter right?
Well, at one level, it's a very simple answer. Commercially, it works. The hypothesis of their leads, our expertise, and that grows, and that would be good. I think more interesting, or as interesting as that, is that this is seen as a genuinely positive, career-defining or career-positive moment for both our team, but also in particular the Softcat team. Getting that mutuality is really, really important. And at the moment, there's lots of excitement, but it's slightly separate. So how do we get that so it's together? And all of that built on a bedrock of ultimately we keep doing good work for customers. Customers keep coming back to us, and the integrity and customer-led solutions and the like. So if we can keep all that together, in a sense, it's a scale-up problem. That would be great. I think the other, sort of a personal ambition, is really seeing the next generation of leadership come on. I get immensely frustrated where groups of people go, oh, well, there's no one ready, and that's an excuse. What is it we have to do to get the next generation leading things? You hold the baton, and probably the biggest skill is knowing when you need to pass the baton on. And I don't want that to be timed by when I retire. If we can get to that point, that would just be awesome.
Kind of related to that, just sort of picking up on a phrase you used, I've certainly heard a number of people say, and I tend to think it's true, nobody's ever ready. Life, forget being CEO, life just comes at you. Being a parent, being, a husband, being a whatever, it just comes at you and you're never really ready, but you just sort of do the best you can.
Completely agree. And time again, when, the classic, isn't it? Someone's off ill or something happens and someone needs to play out of position and they just smash it.
Yeah.
And you go, well, why? Yeah, come on, let people do this. And I suppose that probably is a risk of the corporate thing. We become afraid to take risks. We become afraid to just have a go. I don't think that's going to be a problem, but that might be one of the things where we start to get a bit staid. And how do we keep that sort of fire alive?
Yeah. If I recall right, when we last spoke, you talked about your own kind of definition of success evolving. At one point you thought, okay, if I'm a successful CEO, I kind of hold it all together. Now it's actually, I see successes, I could kind of vanish a bit and everything will go on. Do you think you've reached that point, or is that still a little ways in the future?
A bit like no one's ever ready to step up. I'm not sure you'll ever be ready to hand it off until someone pushes you out the door, if you know what I mean. So I suspect there's a bit of that. I'm intrigued of the Richard of perhaps 15, 20 years ago when I was, desperately trying to climb the corporate ladder, and perhaps some behaviors that weren't particularly wholesome. How do you lean in and are energetic and contributory and respectful and all of that stuff, but in the new guise of Richard, and been doing it his way for the last few years now. It's very intriguing to see, perhaps how I'm hopefully presenting quite differently to perhaps the Richard of 15 years ago.
I think sometimes, particularly acquisitions, can kind of force identities on people that they didn't start off choosing and kind of getting comfortable with that. So we used to be part of this small, maybe 40 years old, but we're a startup. And now we're part of this big listed company. So I've gone from being a startup-y person to being a corporate person. What does that mean for me? Does that mean there's no difference? I'm the same me? Or for a lot of people, it's like, no, actually, somehow it feels different. I've got to adjust to that. I think that's a tricky transition.
Yes, the issue of identity is a life challenge, and I don't think you can be a CEO or an MD of a smallish business unless you obsess about that business. It does just take over your life. You think about it at the start of the day, the end of the day, the middle of the night, and everything in between. But how, despite doing that, do you not put your entire self-worth on have we grown this year, or how many people do we have? And perhaps we're lucky, and you look back in history, I'm not sure it felt lucky at the time, but we have had a couple of points in time where we've got really close to the line. It's easy to say, I think it's harder to do, but I've always said I don't want to be defined by Oakland. And certainly I don't want to be defined by Oakland financial measures or whatever, or the fact that I bought a car or house or whatever. Actually, probably the best thing you can say is I can be defined by Oakland by the people who were there having a really good positive season and a good influence on their life while there, and that reflecting onto our customers and the people around us. And in that sense, I hope that identity can carry on.
Yeah, Richard, as has happened in every conversation I've had with you, it sort of gets deep in a good way very quickly. So thank you for that. And particularly thank you for sharing sort of the personal side of kind of corporate transition that often can seem fairly impersonal. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you, about Oakland, about Softcat, about life?
I suppose the only reflection, particularly on the transaction, is being the balance and perhaps a feeling of, well, it's all about the lawyers, it's all about the written commercials, it's all about, all of that process stuff. And in a sense, quite a combative process because, if the wrong clause gets slipped into the contract, there are plenty of tales of woe, and that's really important because these things can come back and bite you. What surprised me, though, by the end of the day, and it shouldn't have surprised me, is it comes down to trust and, us building those bridges with them. And there was a couple of occasions in the process where the level of thought and care and attention from them really became apparent, and actually an opportunity, probably if they had taken it, where they could have got a better deal or done this or done that. But actually, we worked it out in a really sort of honest and transparent way with one another. And so I don't know why I'm surprised, but funny enough, people buy from people and deals are done with people. And that thrust of building those relationships, and I'm not sure that's a well done us, but it's an interesting observation on probably not quite how I thought it would play out. And I think perhaps if we'd found other partners to go into business with, we may not have got quite to the same style of outcome.
I suspect some of what made that work was what you and Oakland brought to the party, certainly as much as what Softcat brought to the party.
The marriage metaphor is probably over the top, but you've got to have two partners. You don't have to be the same, but you have to want to get married. And if one's intent is a bit nefarious or a bit short term or a bit whatever, then funny enough, it's not going to end very well. And so far, that relatively almost naive approach seems to have panned out, if that makes sense.
Well, that's good to hear. Very good to hear. Thank you again for joining us. It's been really great to kind of get caught up with where you're at and where Oakland's at, and definitely hope we can hear the next chapter, if not 5 years from now, maybe a little sooner. Thanks, Richard.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.